I did say we're going to head to the United States. Can bring into the conversation Congressman Adam Smith, who is a Democratic representative for Washington's 9th District and a ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Thank you very much for joining us, Congressman Smith. If I could ask you, firstly, the big story at the moment, Ben Wallace, our former Defence Secretary, has said that Donald Trump's decision to stop sharing intelligence is suffocating Ukraine. I just wondered your thoughts on the President of the United States making such a bold action like that. Good morning.
Well, first of all, I think Mr. Wallace is absolutely correct. It is a devastating blow to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And, it is having huge implications, along with the cutting off of aid and the cutting off of military support. And I know that President Trump has claimed that he is trying to force a negotiation and get to a peace deal. I don't buy that. I mean, these actions are really having the impact of just giving Putin a wide open door to walk through to attack Ukraine. There's no incentive for Putin to come to the table at this point. So it certainly seems to me like President Trump was listening more to J.D. Vance and Liz Cheney once referred to it as the Putin wing of the Republican Party, that at the end of the day wants a better relationship with Russia, and they don't really care what happens to Ukraine. What Donald Trump has said, and crucially what he has done since he has become president, seems to be that policy, to basically try to build a better relationship with Putin, and he doesn't care about Ukraine. And I'm deeply worried. I think it's a horrible mistake.
On Friday, we saw Donald Trump put out a post on Truth Social where he was starting to turn his sort of attention to Vladimir Putin, saying he'd consider sanctions. And I mean, what's the strategy here, do you think?
I've seen no evidence that tweet and his comments have led to any concrete action. It's funny, my wife and I were talking about this very subject just a little while ago. Well, why would he do that then? And three possibilities enter my head. One, Trump is famous for saying a lot. Comes into his head, boom, he says it, frankly, as no other politician I've ever encountered does, and we can get into that and judge that in a bunch of different ways, but it is an absolute fact. So who knows? Maybe it just, boom, came out. Two, it's possible that he does actually want to get to a peace agreement in Ukraine, and my darker interpretation isn't quite right. And in fact, he put this out because it started to occur to him that, well, maybe if I don't put some pressure on Putin, maybe this isn't going to work. And he's a little dim-witted about the fact that ought to be more obvious than that. But three, I think more likely it's just a distraction. I don't think it changes the fundamental policy approach that I mentioned earlier of wanting the relationship with Russia and not caring about Ukraine. And this is just sort of like a little bit of a deke, if you will, because nothing has happened. I mean, this was 2 days ago. I mean, this guy issues executive orders like, most people breathe, and he hasn't done anything to follow up and actually implement any of those plans.
Yeah, but I mean, people will argue that Joe Biden, of course, he helped Ukraine in terms of supplying arms, but did not do an awful lot in terms of trying to end the war, or certainly wasn't particularly successful at trying to do that.
Yeah, no, look, I have been a voice on the Democratic side not with President Biden. I spoke to Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor. Biden had a couple issues in terms of communication, as we all know. But I spoke to Jake Sullivan. I spoke to the DOD. I spoke to a lot of Eastern European leaders. Heck, I spoke directly to President Zelensky on more than one occasion and said that a maximalist goal for Ukraine, and in a just world, Ukraine gets all of Ukraine back, including Crimea. Putin is charged with war crimes and forced to repay for building Ukraine. In a perfectly just world, certainly. But that is not an achievable objective without an incredibly high level of risk. And I felt that a lot of the rhetoric coming out of President Biden and others who support Ukraine, and I support Ukraine enthusiastically, but a lot of the rhetoric insisting that had to be the outcome was setting us up for failure. And I thought it was appropriate. And like I said, I had this conversation directly with President Zelensky. What is the outcome? Because as long as the war goes on, Ukraine is getting ground down. Put the pressure on Putin. Now, give Ukraine security guarantees. That's the crucial thing that has to be there. We have to make sure that they have a long-term security arrangement and they can defend themselves. This is what Trump has absolutely taken away from them. But sure, I think a reasonable argument could be made. But again, that's not what Trump is doing. cutting off intel sharing, which, by the way, means Ukraine can no longer as effectively see the missiles and drones that are coming at them. They just can't see them. And it just puts them in an incredibly weakened position and prolongs the war. Because if Putin thinks he can keep doing it without being blocked, he's going to keep doing it.
And what do you think of the coverage, just to stay with the Democrats for one moment, what do you think of the coverage? There's a sort of been a bubbling of a story here that Democrats are not being loud enough in their opposition to President Trump, or far from being loud, they're not being heard. They're not actually doing enough to try and counter President Trump. You look at very senior figures, ex-presidents, ex-vice presidents, and of course there are interventions, but we don't hear an awful lot from them.
Yeah, well, I will say yes. We're hearing quite a few folks from what we like to refer to over here as the peanut gallery, offering their opinions about how we who are actually doing it ought to be doing it better. That's not an unusual set of circumstances. It's like me sitting on the couch on a Sunday afternoon watching American football and go, man, why aren't you making that call? All right. I get that, and that's a big part of it. But I will say this. I believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to the republic in the U.S., to our Constitution, to the laws that we have not seen in the lifetime of this country. So the answer to the question of should we all do more, to me is always going to be yes. Yes. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. And this, everything we do, it's like I read this one column that was supposed to be really thoughtful, attacking Alyssa Slotkin, who's the senator who gave our response to the State of the Union. I thought she did a pretty darn good job of giving that response. Thankless job for the most part. And she did a pretty good job. And I said, it just wasn't tough enough. It wasn't tough enough. It didn't get to the urgency of the moment. And then in the same column, they said, oh, and what the Democrats did on the floor of the House during the speech, Al Green waving his cane and yelling at him and the placards. That was just theatrical and like, okay, what would you do? All right. There's no simple solution here. And I think we're suffering from, and part of it is what I said up front. This is an existential threat. This is worth worrying about. I want the problem solved like tomorrow. I don't want to wait, but there's no one tweet. There's no one thing that we're going to do that's going to solve the problem tomorrow. So we have to keep aggressively pushing, but a lot of Democrats are. There's a ton of stuff going on pushing back against this. So even if we haven't solved the problem immediately, I don't think it's fair to say that there's not an effort. We're not the ones who elected the guy.
Given your role on the Armed Forces Committee, I wonder what you think of our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Two things, really. Firstly, he's trying to assemble this coalition of the willing, as he keeps calling it, a very familiar phrase. But of course, as you'll know, in terms of sort of willing countries putting troops on the ground, supporting Ukraine. Your view on that, and then also your view of the idea of peacekeeping troops being in Ukraine.
Yeah, the coalition of the willing does not have a great lineage.
Yes.
I will give you that. But no, I applaud what he's doing. And I applaud his approach to Donald Trump. I mean, he followed the playbook. I happened to watch that whole press conference. It's like, damn, that was well done. And also, I don't know, he had to have a really stiff drink after he was done with that. But I thought it was well played. And yes, I also agree. Europe, if the U.S. is going to take this step back, you have to try to do something because, again, Putin's not going to stop the war. So Europe is going to have to deal with it. If Putin takes Ukraine, it places a great deal more threat throughout Europe in a variety of different ways. So they have to put together whatever coalition they can. However, as the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, we in the U.S. have capabilities in that regard that are simply not matchable by anybody else. So it's a steep hill to go up. But I applaud, the British Prime Minister for playing the cards he's dealt.
When I was covering as in covering from here, I didn't have the privilege of going out, sadly, to Washington, D.C. this time, but I kept using the expression the leader of the free world in terms of the President of the United States by sort of a force of habit. And people were messaging in saying, you can't call America the leader of the free world anymore. Where do you stand on that?
No, under President Trump, we are clearly not. I think he's made it absolutely clear that he has no intention of being that. I don't see how even President Trump could disagree with that assessment. He's made it very clear that the United States of America is now 100% in it for our own self-interest, period, full stop. And furthermore, not just in it for our own self-interest. I came up with this formulation around the Mexico-Canada controversies. Normally when I determine I need something politically, I'm trying to pass a bill, I'm trying to get support, and I figure out who do I need to help me. In this case, Donald Trump wants Mexico's help dealing with the fentanyl crisis and the immigration crisis. The first question I ask is, what does that person need? What do they want? And how can I help them? I help them to get that. They help me to get my thing. One hand washes the other, if you will. So it's the way the human race works. Donald Trump has an entirely different formulation, which is, I want this from you. If you don't give it to me, I'm going to punch you in the face repeatedly until you do. And then I'll tell you what. If you do give it to me, I'm going to keep punching you in the face repeatedly just to make sure you don't even think about not giving it to me. I personally don't think that's a recipe for a very happy existence for us, but it damn sure isn't what the leader of the free world would be doing.
Lastly, again, given your role as the ranked member on the Armed Forces Committee, I wonder. The conversation about defence spending is still a very live one, particularly over here, but across Europe. One positive, I think even Democrats would agree, is that at least Europe is talking about defence spending in a perhaps a far more pointed way than we were before. And I'm sure Donald Trump's sharp elbow helped us get to 2.5%, which we're going to get to in a few years. But I just wonder what you think about European countries and defence spending and whether they are still lagging behind, whether you think it's at least moving in the right direction.
Yes, I think three things about that. First of all, it is good, without question, at this point, that the European countries are stepping up to defend themselves. And without question, Donald Trump's putting pressure on them, or however you want to describe it, has driven some of that. Now, President Obama similarly complained, and I would also submit that Ukraine and Russia's invasion had a heck of a lot more to do with that than any pressure that any American put on Europe. It focused their mind. But to the extent that Donald Trump's pressure helped, that's great. Second thing I think about it is we here in the U.S. have an insufficient appreciation for the fact that this arrangement that Donald Trump and a lot of Americans love to bitch about, whereby we provided security guarantees for Europe, worked out really well for us. The notion that somehow this was our benevolence and we're tired of always paying the bills and whatever, what we set up post-World War II created the most peaceful, prosperous world we've ever known, and the United States of America became the most powerful, wealthiest nation the world has ever known. The idea that we didn't benefit from that arrangement is patently ridiculous. Europe could focus on rebuilding. Peace was that it worked, and we've just dismissed that out of some lack of a sense of history and perspective. And the third thing I think about it is Donald Trump didn't do it to try to get Europe to spend more money. He did it because he didn't want the U.S. to have to spend the money, because he didn't believe in that arrangement that I just described. Again, his perspective is basically what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. The U.S. is going to bully its way through the world. We're not going to do anything for anybody else that doesn't directly and immediately and tangentially benefit us. Any sort of bigger picture thought that I just described doesn't enter his head. So to the extent that Europe has spent more money because of what Trump did, it's not like Trump was trying to do that to strengthen the relationship. I mean, that's just a byproduct of Trump, walking away from said relationship. So that's sort of the three things I look at around that particular issue.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Congressman Adam Smith, who is a Democratic representative for Washington's 9th District, and as we were discussing there, a ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee.